Good evening from Bagram Air Base. This outpost is more than 7,000 miles from home, but for over a decade, it's been close to our hearts. Because here, in Afghanistan, more than 500,000 of our sons and daughters have sacrificed to protect our country. Today, I signed a historic agreement between the United States and Afghanistan that defines a new kind of relationship between our countries. A future in which Afghans are responsible for the security of their nation, and we build an equal partnership between two sovereign states. A future in which war ends and a new chapter begins. Tonight, I'd like to speak to you about this transition. But first, let us remember why we came here. It was here, in Afghanistan, where Osama bin Laden established a safe haven for his terrorist organization. It was here in Afghanistan where al-Qaeda brought new recruits, trained them, and plotted acts of terror. It was here, from within these borders, that al-Qaeda launched the attacks that killed nearly 3,000 innocent men, women, and children. And so 10 years ago, the United States and our allies went to war to make sure that al-Qaeda could never again use this country to launch attacks against us. Despite initial success, for a number of reasons, this war has taken longer than most anticipated. In 2002, bin Laden and his lieutenants escaped across the border and established safe haven in Pakistan. America spent nearly 8 years fighting a different war in Iraq. And al-Qaeda's extremist allies within the Taliban have waged a brutal insurgency. But over the last 3 years, the tide has turned. We broke the Taliban's momentum. We've built strong Afghan security forces. We devastated al-Qaeda's leadership, taking out over 20 of their top 30 leaders. And 1 year ago, from a base here in Afghanistan, our troops launched the operation that killed Osama bin Laden. The goal that I set, to defeat al-Qaeda and deny it a chance to rebuild, is now within our reach. Still, there will be difficult days ahead. The enormous sacrifices of our men and women are not over. But tonight I'd like to tell you how we will complete our mission and end the war in Afghanistan.
When I left Washington in January of 1961, after serving 8 years as Vice President under President Eisenhower, there were no American combat forces in Vietnam. No Americans had died in combat in Vietnam. When I returned to Washington as President 8 years later, there were 540,000 American troops in Vietnam. 31,000 had died there. 300 Americans were being lost every week. And there was no comprehensive plan to end the United States' involvement in the war. I implemented a plan.
First, we've begun a transition to Afghan responsibility for security.
Train and equip the South Vietnamese to withdraw American forces and to end American involvement in the war just as soon as the South Vietnamese had developed the capacity to defend their country against communist
Already
aggression.
nearly half of the Afghan people live in places where Afghan security forces are moving into the lead. This month, at a NATO summit in Chicago, our coalition will set a goal for Afghan forces to be in the lead for combat operations across the country next year. International troops will continue to train, advise, and assist the Afghans and fight alongside them when needed. But we will shift into a support role as Afghans.
And the reason why I am able to announce a stepped-up withdrawal without jeopardizing our remaining forces in Vietnam and without endangering our ultimate goal of ending American involvement in a way which will increase the chances for a lasting peace in the Pacific and in the world.
As we do, our troops will be coming home. Last year, we removed 10,000 U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Another 23,000 will leave by the end of the summer. After that, reductions will continue at a steady pace with more and more of our troops coming home. And as our coalition agreed, by the end of 2014, the Afghans will be fully responsible for the security of their country.
Now on this chart on my right, you can see how our plan has succeeded. In June of 1969, I announced a withdrawal of 25,000 men. In September, 40,000. December, 50,000. April of 1970, 150,000. By the 1st of next month, May 1st, we will have brought home more than 265,000 Americans, almost half of the troops in Vietnam when I took office.
Second, we are training Afghan security forces to get the job done. Those forces have surged and will peak at 352,000 this year. The Afghans will sustain that level for 3 years and then reduce the size of their military. And in Chicago, we will endorse a proposal to support a strong and sustainable long-term Afghan force.
Now, another indication of the progress we have made is in reducing American casualties. Casualties were 5 times as great in the first 3 months of 1969 as they were in the first 3 months of this year, 1971. South Vietnamese casualties have also dropped significantly in the past 2 years. 1 American dying in combat is one too many. But our goal is no American fighting man dying any place in the world. Every decision I have made in the past and every decision I make in the future will have the purpose of achieving that goal.
Third, we're building an enduring partnership. The agreement we signed today sends a clear message to the Afghan people. As you stand up, you will not stand alone. It establishes the basis for our cooperation over the next decade, including shared commitments to combat terrorism and strengthen democratic institutions. It supports Afghan efforts to advance development and dignity for their people. And it includes Afghan commitments to transparency and accountability and to protect the human rights of all Afghans.
When you were working with kind of planning the Vietnam War, did you guys have a perception of what winning would be?
Well, my boss, John McNaughton, former Harvard law professor, and I was his special assistant, did at various times define what winning would be, although he did not expect to achieve it. It was just, here's what our maximum wish list here. And it would be that all, again, as Nixon wanted, all northern troops out of the South back into North Vietnam, evidence that there was no further supply from the North by all communications being in the clear, so that we could read what was going on. Actually, we couldn't read their communications during most of that period. And no further support, basically acceptance of, by the communist-led liberation forces, the resistance, of our, I keep calling it puppet government, there's no really better name, originally Diem, but by this time it was General Thieu, General Key, whose major support, by the way, was the dope trade as well as American money. Very like Afghanistan right now, that's one of the similarities. It was a government without any popular support, but the idea was then that they would be able to handle what any remnant resistance there was if the leaders in Hanoi had totally backed off. And what would make them back off, supposedly, were these threats of escalation. So that would have looked like a victory. In other words, we would still have been essentially appointing the police chief in Saigon, as we did in those days, and controlling the country. It would have been part of our informal empire. That would have been a win. There was no chance of it ever for a month, for a week. I think there were perhaps moments when Viet Cong temporary inactivity led people to be very ambitious right away and say, it's over, we've done it, you know. And then the next offensive would hit.
So bin Laden has apparently been killed, and this is cause for mass celebrations, perhaps because people believe that the cycle of evil will end with this murder. But governments don't solve the problem of evil, because governments always need an enemy to scare you with. The Kaiser, Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, drug dealers, terrorists, and so on and on. But who is the enemy? The death toll from American imperialism, more than 27 million people slaughtered worldwide. Well, I guess 27 million and one will make everything better now. But even if we say that bin Laden needed to be captured or killed, just look at the facts. It took the US government 10 years, 2 wars, almost 1 million deaths, and over $1.1 trillion, interest and inflation not included, to kill one person. This is the same person that the US trained, funded, and armed to fight the Soviets in the 1980s. The same person that the Taliban offered to hand over almost a year before 9/11, as long as the US government provided objective evidence linking him to terrorism, which the US failed to do, even after the Taliban warned Washington that bin Laden was going to strike in the US. After 9/11, the Taliban again offered to turn over bin Laden to a neutral country or the Court of Justice in The Hague, even without evidence. This offer was rejected. And the proof? Well, Colin Powell promised it would be provided. It never was. The British government put together a 21-page dossier on bin Laden, but admitted that it would not amount to a prosecutable case in a court of law. Remember when Saddam Hussein was captured? That was cause for celebration as well. And what changed? If killing bin Laden is a great victory, then wonderful, good job. Give us our freedoms back. Cut the defense budget in half. Bring the troops home, because we're done. What? That's not going to happen? Then stop celebrating and wake up.